So welcome everyone for the afternoon edition of our webinar on anticipating El Niño, what needs to be done. As Anticipation Hub, El Niño is almost part of the origin story because in 2015, when most organizations started piloting anticipatory action and developing the methodology, we did so also very much under the pressure of a previous so-called Godzilla El Niño coming, which everyone was talking about back then. And this year, we again, read in the news about possibly very strong super El Niño coming, and we receive a lot of requests as Anticipation Hub of course, our partners who want to know more about what is really coming, what do we currently know already, what are we still uncertain about, how much time do we have before which impact, what do we need to do. And we are very happy to welcome you to this webinar, which will have two segments. So in the first segment, we will talk a bit more about the forecasting side. So we will be hearing from two experts on what the current outlook is. And then in the second part, we have the practitioners here from different agencies and organizations to tell us a bit more on what's already planned, what's still under development, but also what more is needed and how can we coordinate. We have a quite tight timeline because we have a lot of amazing speakers that I'm very much looking forward to. I'm Stefanie Lux. I'm one of the two heads of the Anticipation Hub with a focus on the learning and exchange. So today we are here to do both, right? Learn about what others are doing and what the forecasts say and to exchange what each of us are planning. We will share a survey later on where you are also really invited to share what you are planning, that we want to also then collect this information for the Anticipation Hub. Don't want to take too much time for introductions of all participants. I'm glad to see that we are quite some despite the late slot. This morning we were also very numerous. But it would be great if you could all introduce yourselves in the chat and also tell us, from which organization and which region you are joining from. We will start with the forecasting block, this webinar, and this will be followed by the questions to Chris Funk and Chris Jack. And then for the second part of the practitioners, we will go through all the practitioner interventions and then have questions at the end to all of them, but do feel free to already type them in the chat so you have them out and then we have them ready at the end. So our first speaker is Chris Funk, the director of the Climate Hazards Center of the University of California in Santa Barbara, who has worked, I think, on the El Niño, among others, for a long time. And yes, I hand over the floor to you, Chris. Welcome to this community. I'm very excited to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Yes, so I actually got started working with the Famine Early Warning Systems Network way back after the 1997-98 El Niño, where my mentor, Jim Verdon, actually, asked the idea, like, could we use information about El Niños to improve food security outcomes? And here we are many years later. And it's been wonderful to see the anticipatory community really grow so much over that time. So as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, and it's probably why you're on this call, the latest forecasts call for a strong to incredibly strong El Niño. On the left are the latest forecasts from the CFS V2 model from June 1st. And you can see importantly that the strength of the El Niño increases between June up into October, November, December. And so that's going to have important consequences about which places get hit the most later in the season. And you see a similar behavior from the ECMWF forecast model, though it's even more aggressive in terms of its heating. So I'm not sure whether we're going to see a strong, very strong, or exceptionally incredibly strong El Niño. But I think all those cases are going to probably have relatively similar impacts. Something to be aware of is that since the 2015 El Nino, which is represented here with the relative oceanic Niño index, or RONI, for October, November, December, this is the 2015 event. There's been basically 4 El Niños, 3 of them strong or very strong, and 7 La Niñas. So there's been an almost, unceasing swing between these 2 states. I would argue made stronger due to climate change. And so now we're looking at a strong El Nino, or a very strong El Nino again. On the bottom is a link to the FuseNet white paper on El Nino teleconnections. So we can think about different outcomes. We know that there's going to be a high probability of dry, hot weather in the maritime continent around Indonesia. That's the most strong teleconnection. We know that there's going to be a really high probability of elevated extreme heat risks in many areas, and I'll talk about that. We are concerned about potential dry, hot weather in Ethiopia, India, Southeast Asia. And we're working right now with the Ethiopian Meteorological Institute and the IGAD Center for Climate Predictions and Applications on an alert for Ethiopia. I'll share some of those results. Then as we go into the fall, we're going to be worried about very likely extreme rains in East Africa. I'll talk about that. And then the other Chris will take over and talk about very likely dry, hot weather, I think, in Southern Africa, and probably very likely dry, hot weather in Central and Northern America. So, we're going to start in boreal summer. I'll take us through to the short rainy season in East Africa, and then we'll hand things over to Chris. One of the things that we really need to be aware of is the strong connection between El Nino events and extreme temperatures. So here I'm showing global population weighted average days with maximum temperatures greater than the historical 95th percentile in these different months. And you can see that there's a big El Nino signal and a big trend. And so, whether we're going to have the greatest monster El Nino of all time or an event that was similar to 2023-24, it's absolutely certain, in my view, that we're going to see a lot of extreme temperatures because of the convolution of these 2 signals. And we know that when a parcel of air warms, right, the nitrogen and oxygen molecules inside that parcel of air spread apart, so it can hold more water vapor. This is absolutely certain. But this has, 2 different types of effects. In dry areas, this warmer air can suck more moisture out of the landscape. And we'll talk in a few minutes about risks that could be posing in arid areas in Turkana, Kenya, and Somalia. But we also know that warmer air holds more water. So for the same amount of vertical uplift in a warmer atmosphere, we can get more intense precipitation. So we're also going to be worried about extreme flooding. So if we just look here in the Early Warning Explorer from UC Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara, at standardized temperature anomalies for 2015 in August. This isn't a forecast. This is just going back and looking at the last very strong event at places that were very hot. In August, we saw, exceptionally high temperatures across Ethiopia and Somalia, exceptionally high temperatures across parts of India, and most of Central America. And so this is just a single year. We're not going to get exactly the same outcome this August, but these are regions that we should be worried about things being exceptionally hot. In 2015, we had just released the Climate Hazards Infrared Precipitation with Stations database, and we're running hydrologic models for Ethiopia. So we did a lot of work for the drought there. So in June, July, August, September, it was exceptionally dry. It was a huge humanitarian crisis. And we're worried about another drought this year. So we're just in the process of working on a blog post that you can find probably later this week at blog chcucsb.edu, where we are looking at the chance of below normal rains during El Nino years. So just basically, recent moderate to strong El Ninos. And there's a big, intersection between areas in Ethiopia that are really heavily populated and that are likely to be dry. So we're going to be concerned about that and are starting messaging with the Ethiopian Meteorological Institute. Other places over the summer, June, July, August, September, that are typically dry during El Ninos, are again Central America, shown on the left. These are rainfall anomalies from the CHIRPS data set for those same El Ninos. India has a tendency to be dry, and of course, the Indonesia maritime continent area. So moving forward, another season to September, October, November, December. On the left was a forecast that we made in 2023, where we were arguing that it was exceptionally likely that Eastern East Africa during their short rainy season was going to be exceptionally wet because we were seeing these super warm sea surface temperatures in the Western Indian Ocean. If we look at the current forecasts for this upcoming season in October, November, December, these are just from yesterday. Again, we see a very, very strong El Nino signal in the CFS model, very warm sea surface temperatures in the Western Indian Ocean, and like positive Indian Ocean dipole conditions. So we're already starting to think about how to get ready for extreme rains in East Africa this coming fall, October, November, December. So we're going to be looking at that. And I think this time around, as opposed to 2023, we have a lot better subseasonal forecast system set up. So that's a real benefit. And finally, if we just look at recent precipitation anomalies from the University of California Climate Hazard Center early estimate products, we can see that if we combine preliminary CHIRPS data, that's observed rainfall for May 1st to the 25th, plus forecast data for the next 15 days from May 26th to June 10th, we can see some concerning really dry areas like in northwestern Kenya and Turkana, in central eastern Somalia, and in the Afar region of Ethiopia that have been really quite dry. And I'm concerned that as we're starting to see this warming signal in the air temperatures coming from El Nino, that could combine to create really poor pasture conditions. So to conclude, we are going to see a strong or very strong or record-breaking El Nino event. The influence of a trend plus El Nino will almost certainly produce record-shattering extreme air temperatures. Warmer air plus El Nino influences will produce more intense droughts and more intense flooding. But in contrast with 2015 and even 2023, we should be better able to anticipate these shocks due to improved forecast systems and improved anticipatory action communities. So thanks to you all for the work you're doing.
Thank you so much, Chris. Could you give us a concrete example, like from a practitioner side, like what these improved subseasonal forecasts that you talked about, like how we could use them, like how they would improve our lead time or what we can rely on?
Yeah, thank you. So, for example, we've been working with the Kenya Meteorological Services Authority and the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology and the Famine Early Warning Systems Network to improve subseasonal forecasts in Kenya. And these are now being produced by the Kenya Met Agency every day and going out 45 days. And they've already been using them to anticipate some of the extreme rainfall events they've had over the last couple months. And looking forward, we would like to be using these forecasts to help anticipate extreme temperatures in the Kakuma refugee camp in northwestern Kenya and in Turkana. And we, as we go into the short rainy season, October, November, December, we're hoping to work with them to better anticipate flooding in the Tana River Basin. We'd also like to be talking to people in Somalia about the Juba and Shebele. So those were things that I think, as a practitioner, we should have flooding in the Juba, Shebele, and Tana River basins should have been on our radars in 2023 when we were looking at this El Nino Indian Ocean dipole event. And we did a great job on a seasonal forecasting time scale, but I think this time we should do better at a subseasonal kind of individual event, I hope.
Thank you, Chris. I will hand over to Chris Jack now, who's the science lead of the Climate Center, so also working a lot with national societies on triggers, on how to account for El Nino in EAPs and so on. But he's also the director of the Climate Systems Analysis Group at the University of Cape Town, and in both roles very busy with El Nino currently. Chris also kindly did the morning edition of this webinar. Chris, do you want to come into compliment?
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'd actually love to just carry on chatting to the other Chris, because I have a lot of interesting things to talk about. And I wasn't, full disclosure, I had no idea what Chris was going to present. And so there's quite a bit of overlap. So I've been going through like hiding slides, but let's just plow on. I'll skip through stuff that Chris has already covered and maybe take a slightly different angle on things. I think what I'm going to present is a bit broader. I will zoom into the South and Central America a little bit at the end. Yeah, I did want to just quickly step back. I'm going to keep this very short for those who may not be familiar with El Nino. For those of us who are in it all the time, this is very familiar. But useful just to remember that this is a phenomenon that occurs across the tropical Pacific Ocean, where we have a shift in the strength of the trade winds, sometimes a reversal in those trade winds, and it results in a shift in warm water and cooler water across the tropical Pacific Ocean basin. So this is the El Nino phenomenon. It expresses in different ways, and I'll show you some maps in a minute. But fundamentally, this is what we're talking about. There's lots of questions at the moment around El Nino and super El Ninos and climate change. And we just had an internal team meeting discussing all of this as well. This is a similar graph to what Chris put up just now around the relative oceanic Nino index, which in itself is an interesting index because it's partly come out of a response to the fact that oceans are warming, ocean basins are warming due to climate change. And so the existing ENSO indices were being a bit distorted by that warming. So Ronnie is the way that we're doing it now. So highlighting these very strong events. A super El Nino is something that's to some extent more in the media than in the science literature, but really indicates these strong events of 2 degrees up to 2.5 degrees sometimes, temperature anomalies. So we've got those past events. The 2023-24 one looks a bit different under this index and this particular data set, but was also a strong event. The big question is whether climate change is shifting El Nino, and if we refer to the IPCC assessment, which tends to be quite conservative, they basically conclude that climate change is not shifting the El Nino variability as such. What is changing is the magnitude of the responses to El Nino. So the intensity of droughts and floods in response to El Nino seems to be shifting because of climate change, and that's something we can understand. Going into the future, there isn't a lot of confidence in the message about how El Nino might change. It'd be interesting to get Chris's views on that. There are some papers that point to changes, but it's still quite uncertain. We know the climate models don't represent some of the dynamics very well. So if you have questions around climate change and El Nino, maybe we can pick that up in the discussions. Yeah, just looking at the sea surface temperature patterns, it's quite interesting. And the reason I want to emphasize this is that El Ninos do unfold in different ways. In the Pacific Ocean, we sometimes get stronger Central Pacific El Ninos, sometimes stronger Eastern Pacific El Ninos. And that has an impact on how things unfold around the world. But even more detailed than that, there are ocean temperature anomalies around the world that also have impact. So Chris mentioned the Indian Ocean dipole as a really important driver for East Africa. We also look at equatorial Atlantic temperatures for West African climate. But the El Nino phenomenon is one of the strongest drivers. So this is for the 2015 event, a really strong El Nino, and you can see the classic pattern of warm water across the tropical Pacific, Eastern tropical Pacific. This is different ones. This is December 2023. And you can see a different pattern emerge. You still see El Nino, but you can see tropical Atlantic Ocean much warmer, Northern Atlantic Ocean cooler, Western Indian Ocean much warmer. So different patterns unfolding. This is where we were in December 2025, so a few months ago, as La Nina was kind of tapering off and we were heading back into neutral conditions. And then finally, this is where we are now, with El Nino starting to form. Interesting, really strong area of warm water off the North American continent, which Chris probably knows much more about than me. And this warm water pool forming off the coast of South America, of Peru. It actually came up this morning, the El Nino Castillo effect that affects part of the Peruvian coastline and can produce really strong flooding events there. So we can see these kind of patterns emerging. This is a map that is, I think, quite useful. It was produced by the IRI a few years ago. I will say it's very generalized. I was chatting to one of the people, Andrew, who was involved in developing it. And it is very generalized, but it's a nice starting point if you're wanting to start thinking of what could be the impact in my particular region. This gives you a starting point to then dig further and ask more questions. But we can see definitely what Chris has already spoken about in East Africa, what I'm concerned about in Southern Africa, dry conditions later in the year, going into next year, and similarly across the region. What does it actually look like? Again, to emphasize that it can look very different under different El Ninos. So this is very coarse. I just pulled this together last night, looking at SPEI, which is a drought index, and how that's looked under different El Nino conditions. I've averaged across all sorts of seasons here. So again, very coarse, and just trying to get a global picture. So 1982-83 was another strong event, and particularly in Southern Africa, we had a lot of droughts where I am, but also some in South America and across the oceanic continent and Australia. 1997-98 was another event with some quite different unfoldings and different patterns across the globe, but some similar patterns to a normal El Nino. 2015-2016 is kind of the archetype, really big, strong El Nino, and we can see the very familiar patterns there, and drought in East Africa, Southern Africa, across Brazil, parts of South America, Indian subcontinent, Northern Australia. So some very strong drought impacts with that event. And then this recent one, 22-23, also really strong. Again, El Nino plus other patterns, ocean temperature patterns across the world. Again, the emphasis here is not to say we look back at these to see what's going to happen this time, but rather to say we expect things to unfold differently. We also know the world is warming, so we expect temperatures to be higher for this particular event. And the key thing is to be looking at the forecasts that are available. We do, as Chris has already said, we know that we have very high temperatures that occur during El Nino years. Sorry, some of my labels dropped off this one. 2016, 2023, 24 were very, well, 24 particularly was a very hot year. And we do anticipate 26 to be a very hot year. Chris has showed these already, the forecast plumes. But what I did want to just show is back to July 2023, I pulled out the one for the last briefing we did for that one, to show a slightly different forecast period, but a similar forecast plume, though this year does seem to be a stronger forecast, so more intense event forecast. This is the IOD forecast that Chris mentioned. So again, nudging towards a positive IOD in the Indian Ocean. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these. We can, there's links to the bottom here. I'm going to just focus on the IRI forecasts going out in the next few months. And Chris has already spoken a lot about East Africa and Asia. So for South America, we can already see that there are dry conditions developing. There's already been EAP, drought EAPs triggered in the Caribbean and Central American region. I think my colleague Juan is actually on the call, so he can speak more about those. So really there we are seeing dry conditions that potentially already linked to some of the emerging SST patterns. As we go forward, that evolves further. We can see the drought forecasting in East Africa, wet conditions then in Somalia as we get into August, September, October. Oopsie. And I'm going to skip through these ones. So September, October, November on the right there is what I'm concerned about in Southern Africa is the forecast of dry conditions developing there. Currently not particularly strong, but definitely there. What I will say, of course, and I think Chris will back me up here, the forecast at these kind of scales have a lot of uncertainty at the moment. The skill levels are relatively low, both because of predicting El Niño at this point in the year, but also predicting out beyond a few months for many of these regions has quite low skill. So look at these with like step back 10 meters and look at these maps to get a general idea of where things are going. Just lastly for South America, zooming in, some quite clear signals developing across the northern parts of South America, Central America. And on the right there, the temperature forecasts as well, which are developing. Okay, last one is a global temperature slide, because people are asking about temperature forecasts, and particularly those in Europe who are just currently going through very high temperatures. And actually looking at the forecast for July, August, September, high temperatures in many places around the world, but perhaps not so much in Europe, which is interesting. So, okay, I think Chris covered a lot. I think what we wanted to just sort of end with from the Climate Center side is that, again, El Niños unfold in different ways, depending on a lot of different things in the climate system. But also what we really want to emphasize, and Chris has already alluded to this, is considering the current context, both the current recent climate events, droughts and floods and so on, but also the socioeconomics. We know that we're dealing with a world of complex socioeconomics at the moment, high fuel prices, high fertilizer prices, different conflicts in different regions, and various health crises emerging like Ebola and others. So thinking about those in the context of this current El Niño is really important. So we learn from previous events, but we can't assume the same kind of outcomes. So going forward, really just want to encourage you to keep engaging with your national and regional climate information, working with people like ICPAC in East Africa, like Chris supporting them, and the other regional centers. We can provide support on making connections to those. Really thinking through the current local, regional, and global context, what it means in your particular work. And then seek expert guidance and advice. Climate Center here to support with the hub, but also your regional partners, Met Services. Seek that out where you can. I'll leave it there. Open to questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. And this seems to be a very Chris topic because we have a third Chris in the chat who also works on El Niños and is asking if Chris Hilbrunner, if you either of you have a view on what's expected on West Africa, Sahel. There have been negative anomalies in the past. What's your level of concern for that region? The IRI forecasts don't show much in the way of negative anomalies, but is that a skill issue or real indication that we shouldn't be too concerned? That's a tricky one. Which Chris wants to start?
I mean, Chris can go, but West Africa is a bit complicated with El Niño. There is some kind of influence, but it's also very strongly moderated by the tropical Atlantic Ocean temperatures, which are currently fairly neutral from what I've seen. Yeah, but the influence is quite subtle, and actually a little bit different on the eastern and western parts of West Africa. But maybe Chris has a better perspective.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right, Chris. I mean, I think the teleconnection is more complicated and non-stationary than people often assume. And yeah, what happens in the Atlantic is really important too. So, but I will say a shout out to Chris Hildrunner, who is an old friend of mine from FuseNet days. Good to see you. Yeah, so sorry, Chris Hildrunner, but I don't. Yeah, I think they're given historic teleconnections. We should probably be concerned about a potential, tilt towards below normal. But I think the confidence of that in Southern Africa or Ethiopia, for example, would be much stronger, just given historical teleconnection stream.
Perfect. So can I ask you, after both of your presentations, where currently, like Chris Funk, you seemed quite decided that, this will be very strong or super or record. Would you say most models are aligned on that?
No, I don't. I mean, I think there's some discrepancy between the current. By the way, it's June 2nd, and all the forecast models are just updating now. So we're, in a week, things will potentially look. We'll get more confirmation whether we're tilting towards a really strong event or not. But Steffi, what I was trying to convey isn't so much that I'm sure it's going to be a super strong El Nino, but I'm pretty sure that we're going to be looking at at least a strong El Nino, and that it'll have robust. I mean, like Chris said, the other Chris. I mean, like 1997, 98 in Zimbabwe, there was a really strong El Nino, and there was not drought, right? So it's not like every time there's an El Nino, the same thing happens. But I am confident that we are in that elevated risk, kind of strong El Nino part of the distribution. So, yeah, Chris, would you buy that?
Yeah, completely. And I guess at this point, it comes down to how do we respond to that? And it doesn't make any sense to be not planning for El Nino. I can't see any argument for that. So.
Yeah, I think what came out strongly this morning is that there can be a very strong El Nino, but then, as you said, for Zimbabwe this morning, I mentioned Peru in 2015, where we waited. And that, it doesn't have to mean there are extreme impacts in every country. But there is a question by Jaffa on can we predict the country-specific impacts, and when can we predict them, and where could we find that information? And I think Chris Jack, but also Chris Funk already mentioned, the national Met offices, the regional forecasters. There's also the World Climate Outlook. I think we can share those links for registration for that regular information. But anything else you want to say to Jaffa about when and where we can find info on the expected country-specific impacts, which don't only depend on the El Nino? Yep.
Yeah, there's a whole set of climate outlook forums for different parts of the world. And so, Chris Jack could talk about the SADC Climate Services Center and the, SARCOF, Southern African Regional Climate Outlook Forum. There's a similar, forum for East Africa, for West Africa, different parts of South America. So, that is a great resource of people that are, experts for their regions and their countries.
Just to add one thing, the scale of the seasonal forecast is very variable across the world, across different countries and for different seasons. There is typically higher skill when there is a strong forcing like El Nino, but only for some regions. So yes, look at the forecast, but also ask questions about skill, like how often has this been right in the past? Yeah. Good.
In the chat, we also have a question by Celine that she says that she sort of remembers that the impact of El Nino for East Africa depends a lot on the Indian Ocean dipole. I think this was mentioned by you, Chris, Jack, but briefly, and by you, Chris, also. Do we have the same condition as in 2015? She asked. I think.
I'll leave that to you, Chris. You're the expert on this one.
Yeah. Well, so the Indian Ocean dipole is primarily impactful during the October, November, December short rainy season. So, for Ethiopia, the teleconnection is much more just driven by El Nino during the current rains in the summer. So, for the October, November, December, there's not always a positive Indian Ocean dipole, which is associated with really warm water in the Western Indian Ocean when there's an El Nino, but there usually is. So they're not 100% the same thing, but they're very correlated. So, again, we haven't really, we've started to look at the forecast for that for October, November, December, and it looks to us like 2023, in 2015. So we're concerned. But we're focused right now on Ethiopia because it's much closer in. But probably later this month, you might even look for our blog post and we'll see if we can look more in detail for the short rainy season. But the skill for the Indian Ocean dipole is pretty weak this far out. But when there's a strong El Nino, that sets up winds over the Indian Ocean that tend to shift waters to the Western Indian Ocean. And there's typically a positive Indian Ocean dipole in October, November, December, if there's a strong El Nino. So, I'm prevaricating a little bit because I haven't jumped in and we've looked quickly at the forecasts based on May, and we're going to update them soon for June. But we should be concerned about heavy rains, but also, it's also a benefit, right? So in 2023, in the short rains in Kenya, there was also good crop production. So, extremes can also be beneficial if managed correctly.
Thank you. I just want to highlight that Juan Basso, who's the climate center advisor for the Americas, is highlighting that an important consideration is that not all El Nino events produce the same impacts, although historical records help identify areas and sectors that may be affected. Each event has unique characteristics in terms of intensity, timing, spatial distribution, and interaction of other climate drivers. Yes, so the observed impacts can differ significantly. I think both of you also said this in slightly different words, but I think it was also a strong focus this morning that you cannot directly compare. And then if we look from a humanitarian angle, the impacts always also depend on other factors, right? Chris, Jack, we discussed it this morning that currently in many countries that will be affected, there's already a lot of other crises going on. We have the global raised costs for fuels and fertilizers and other goods. We have conflicts in some of these areas or ongoing droughts for many years. So there is the impacts of course, will be related also to El Nino, but depend a lot on other factors. So I think that's what we will hear also from our next presenters, who will look really at what impacts they are expecting and how they want to deal with them. Are there any other questions to the two Chris's? And it was a lovely combination. We should do a follow-up webinar with both of you when the forecasts progress, I think. if there are more questions, both Chris Jack and Chris Funk have agreed to also answer them in the chat. So please feel free to put them also in the chat for Chris Funk and Chris Jack if you have forecasting or if you have questions on the presentations and what they entail. Then I would move over to our next speaker, who actually has also a similar background. And I'm curious, Jessie, if you agree with all that has been said as another forecasting expert. But Jessie is no longer mainly working on forecasts, but I mean, but he's the Global Anticipatory Action Coordinator of WFP, and he's here also to tell us a bit about an upcoming brief of FAO and WFP on the impacts on food security specifically that FAO and WFP are expecting, how both organizations are preparing, what plans are in place, what's missing, where we all need to come together. Jessie, floor is yours.
Okay, I'm hoping you can see my screen.
Not presentation mode yet, but yes, we can.
All right. There we go.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone. As Stephanie mentioned, my background is in atmospheric science, and it's one of the reasons why I was brought over to WFP to lead their anticipatory action program many years ago. And so it gives me a sort of a unique perspective on sort of bridging the gap between what we just heard from Chris and colleagues and what needs to happen on the ground. In fact, some of the comments in the chat are exactly the things that I have to deal with every day. So today I'm speaking on behalf of WFP and FAO. As many of you know, WFP and FAO are leading the charge alongside our colleagues in OCHA and UNICEF and others in building out anticipatory action for the UN, but also for our country programs. And what we've heard today, right, is something that we've heard for many years, in fact, about El Niños, about the risk to scale, about the ability to actually look into where these things are impacting, you know, at the community level and the challenges and the need to be ready. That FAO and WFP have decided that indeed this is not going to be another El Nino where we sit back and wait. In fact, we recognize that there is an importance in us acting ahead. Using, you know, many of the things that we just heard from Chris and many of the things that we've just discussed in terms of teleconnections and impacts and when we expect them to happen. You'll see in these bullet points here that you know, we're focusing on many of the same countries that were just brought up, but one of the big pieces for us is the third bullet, which is the agricultural season timing, and that along the operational needs are two of the biggest concerns for us. So, you know, when we're trying to manage what we've heard from the scientists in terms of, well, let's wait, right? Let's wait for the next model, or let's wait until we get closer. Wait is something that the UN is quite good at. And in fact, we probably can wait until a whole year for the impacts on these crops before we need to start responding. And that's exactly what we're trying to change here, right? We're trying to say that, in fact, together we need to start to act before these impacts. And I think many of you understand that behind AA, and this idea behind FAO and WFP putting together a joint appeal alongside support from OCHA and others is to start to bring all of these pieces together, including the investments that Chris had mentioned in KMD and EMI, and start to understand exactly where can we find that sweet spot behind, you know, waiting until we have the perfect forecast, which essentially will never occur, and absorbing some of that risk and understanding that we've heard the scientific colleagues talk about. But of course, you know, I can't step back from the IRI forecast. I can't look at an entire continent, because at the end of the day, you know, many of the activities that we're talking about need to go to a person at a household. And so we still need to make that jump behind aligning to agricultural seasons. So as we know in Southern Africa, that's coming up rapidly. Waiting until July for WFP and FAO and many of our partners to start building these programs, identifying which person, right? Ultimately, it's a person needs to receive this support and these investments, and the ability for us to do it at scale, and the ability for us to do that with all of our partners takes time. Right, so when we put out this appeal to talk about some of the activities that we can do jointly with our cooperating partners, with people on this phone call, we're running out of time, right? So in one sense, we have our scientific colleagues saying, let's wait, and the other side, we're seeing that timing has almost been gone, is almost gone, especially when we look at Southern Africa, especially when we look at the kind of timings we need for these investments in some of those activities I just showed you. And in fact, the realities of doing anything for flood infrastructure and the time that we have. I don't know, maybe Chris can give us an idea of what he means by 2-week flood forecast. I suspect they're not what we're going to need in order to be able to put money into a person's home, money into a household, or some of those activities that you just saw. And when we lose that sort of timeline, that ability to ask for funds, right? So it's one thing to come up with these activities, then we need to make sure that we have the money behind them, and then we need to deliver them. We often miss these agricultural windows, right? And these increased humanitarian needs and responses come much later. And you consistently see this sort of push and pull behind, well, why don't we just wait? Well, if the scientists are saying to us it's not skillful enough, it's not good enough, et cetera, then just wait. And it's a terrible position for us to all be in, because as you saw in the initial slide, and as we've already all discussed, acting early is incredibly important, is one of the biggest things that we can do as humanitarians. And so, that's why I started this presentation as my role and sort of trying to bridge that gap. And I think, this idea that the Climate Center and the Red Cross was put together and bringing us together is exactly what we need to see, and exactly need to work together. We're all working in Kenya, we're all working in Ethiopia. And so we need to make sure that those investments are working at scale, but also, of course, need to be left behind so that national governments, local governments can respond to the types of hazards that they should be responding to. Not every hazard needs to have the UN step up. And I think this is the role that we can all play together. And one of the things I hope we can use this current El Nino as sort of a platform for us all to stand on and to articulate these pieces. So we heard, we hope it's not like this past El Nino, et cetera. There are some things that I think collectively we can do to make sure it's not. And it's not just blaming the scientists that it's not skillful enough, and it's not just blaming the humanitarians that they all want to wait. We need to find that sweet spot. So maybe I can just leave it there and save a few minutes for some questions. Yeah, I'll stop sharing now so I can see everyone.
Thanks, Jesse. Call for action. To be fair to our scientists, I don't think they told you to wait.
No, exactly.
But,
right? There's this feeling as we work on this appeal together, and Julia knows well that there's this constant question, are you 100% correct? I mean, nothing in life is 100% correct, right? And so we need to find a way in which our scientific colleagues can get behind our risk appetite as well. Otherwise, we'll just continually see an interest to just wait. And unfortunately for us to see this work at scale, the type of impacts we want to see, and in fact, when we start to be able to articulate those impacts and evidence, is exactly how we make improvements to early warning systems, right? So it's not just about a skill score getting better, but it's about our ability to reach more people, our ability to save more people, our ability to do more of those activities in that slide at scale, and working together to say to our donor governments, this is exactly why you need to keep funding the Climate Center. This is exactly why you need to keep making sure national meteorological agencies continue to receive priority funding, et cetera, because these are the things that we can do. And so I think that's been lost a little bit because everyone's been focused on their piece, but now this is the opportunity for us to start to work that together. And I think this El Nino and this idea behind FAO and WFP coming together, you may be very surprised to hear that it would be the first joint appeal by WFP and FAO, which is kind of insane. But this is the type of momentum we all need to use, and it's not just about WFP saving lives. It's about making sure people recognize it's due to the investments of the Climate Center, et cetera, into our national government partners. Over.
Thank you, Jesse. I think one question I would have, because I mean, you've seen now just in your time working on anticipatory action, the 2015, 2016 event, you've seen the 23, 24, like for you, like, you know, what's different this time, both in positive and negative, maybe?
Well, I just think we just have, I mean, look at this, the diversity on this call, right? I think there are people from all different sectors coming together to understand what their role can be in this joint sort of, intervention, because we need everyone to sort of come together in this space. Otherwise, we're I mean, you saw the picture of the world there. There was a lot of red all over the place. And unless we all come together on that, like we're doing now, this is our opportunity, and we just can't let it go. So I'm quite happy with that. Obviously, the ability to get the UN to work together and jointly advocate and not forget our little partners and countries and scientists is a remarkable shift from what it was in 2015. And it's not about an appeal to get ready and wait. It's about appeal to get ready and work. And that's a remarkable difference. And it's based on the work that we've been doing with, I mean, OCHA, as far as I'm concerned, these frameworks that we've all come together on have been sort of the catalyst for this, right? A catalyst for the UN 80, a catalyst of how we all work together. That meant, just to give you guys a bit of a feel from internally, when I put this appeal together to my supervisors, they asked, where do these numbers come from? And we said, we have every single country of those 22 countries I put there has an anticipatory action plan or framework identifying how many people they're going to reach, which organizations are going to reach it, how much money they have, how much money they need. It's done. It's been approved a year ago, last year, last 6 months. It's fantastic. I don't need to guess anymore. And this is a massive change.
Thank you, Jesse. There is an answer to your flood comment, just from my side. There is also good early actions we can still do 2 weeks ahead, even if it's not flood infrastructure. But moving on, we talked about coming together, about acting together, about coordination. So that's a perfect intro to Julia joining. So Julia Wittig is the Global Anticipatory Action Coordinator and will tell us a bit more about where OCHA currently stands in, getting all frameworks ready for El Nino. The floor is yours, Julia.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Good to be here. What a panel to join. Thank you. I'm hoping that this is starting. Okay, just getting it into presentation mode. There we go. All right. So, hi from New York. I'll just say a few things about where, how we're looking at this from an OCHA perspective. I'm very much going to echo what Jesse just said about, seizing the moment and how we're actually in a much better position than we have been previously. So the colleagues, Chris already gave us a really good overview of where we are with the forecasts. I'm not going to repeat that. I just want to reiterate that, according to the analysis that we're seeing, we think that El Nino could cut GDP by 0.6 to 1.7 percentage points in vulnerable countries and raise public debt to GDP by over 2 percentage points in the coming year. And as you already said, Stephanie, fragile states are experiencing conflict. in Iran and related constrained aid budgets, impacts on prices. So the El Nino is also taking place in a broader global context. Let me focus on what's different this time from our perspective. And I recognize this is somewhat our perspective. And so we have 11 coordinated AA frameworks for El Nino related shocks, plus another 18 frameworks for climate emergencies and disease outbreaks. And even if when we're in an El Nino context, we might still see events happening that are not directly related to El Nino. So that's why I'm also referencing those other frameworks. We've got we just added pre-arranged funding in another country, I think last week. So we're at 23 countries that we're covering now with our UN partners and their implementing partners. And this is just that sort of joint collective UN plus side. And then obviously, as we've seen with the Anticipation Hub report last week, there's many more partners that have anticipatory action frameworks that are ready to go. From an OCHA perspective, we have 5 frameworks that have already triggered. I'll come to those in a second. That's 17.4 million that we have dispersed already, covering 450,000 people. The IAC Global Answer Analysis Cell convened in May, so system-wide readiness is happening. The Central Emergency Response Fund is developing a proactive allocation strategy that's going to target high-risk countries where we don't have anticipatory action frameworks. So we're not just, limited to where we have frameworks. We're very much proactive. And I think the whole work that's been done by partners in the anticipatory action space over the last 10 years, is really driving our ability to also be much more proactive, even where we don't have frameworks. All of our OCHA regional offices are getting ahead. They've have plans active in Asia Pacific, in Southern and Eastern Africa, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in Western Central Africa. So we are ready to go. We look at this as 3 windows to get ahead, and this is particularly important for drought. So for where we stand now, for countries that have a rainy season that is happening over the next sort of 3 to 4 months, the window that we are looking at now is protecting the harvest and infrastructure. So getting ahead of the rainy season to safeguard livestock, protect harvests, reinforce flood protection infrastructure. This is what we need to focus on right now. What we then see coming over the next few months is mitigation of immediate consequences. So water harvesting, ensuring school retention when families' incomes drop, mitigating protection risks, ensuring smaller scale food production, and ensuring health system readiness before the failed season, before a failed harvest turns into a full-blown humanitarian crisis. And then as a last resort, we're also getting ready to deliver humanitarian assistance. So when communities already face loss of life, assets and livelihoods from flooding or rising hunger as food stocks run out, we need to be ready to launch the full-scale response. In terms of our collective anticipatory action frameworks, so these are UN plus NGO and government and Red Cross partner frameworks. We have for the coming months, so for the June to September period, we have the Burkina Faso, Chad, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Honduras, Mauritania, and Niger frameworks that are ready, that we have lined up. 5 of those have already triggered. So we triggered in March, so 2 months ago, over 2 months ago, actually, in the dry corridor for El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So that assistance, I was informed today, has already been delivered by the partners. I know that the Red Cross has also triggered in El Salvador. I know WFP is also triggered in Nicaragua. So that response is well underway to really support people ahead of the season. and we have triggered Chad a month ago and Mauritania. Now, colleagues, we're discussing about the impacts of El Nino in the Sahel. Our forecasts are indicating to us that the rainy season for those countries will be below average. And we're not just working based on an El Nino forecast, we're working based on a seasonal forecast that's released by the Met services of those countries, and those obviously take into consideration El Nino. But because we have those frameworks, we've done historical analysis, we've done very thorough analysis, and so we have decided that the forecasts that we have give us sufficient confidence to act now. And what those forecasts are saying is that we're expecting below average rainy seasons in Mauritania and Chad. I think the Mauritania trigger has a sort of 6.5 year, 1 in 6 year return period, so it's going to be a severe drought. In Chad, it's looking similar, and that's what we're launching anticipatory action for to get ahead of. Beyond September, we have another 3 frameworks, so we're ready for increased cyclones in Fiji. We're finalizing a framework for cyclones in Vanuatu, and we've just prearranged funding for floods in Somalia. So we're getting ahead of OND floods in Somalia as well. And of course, that's all part of a larger portfolio of 29 frameworks in 23 countries. And beyond that, the SURF is already getting ready to look at countries where they can provide more proactive support without frameworks. Now, I think my last point here today is complementing what Jessie has said, that we need to look at this from beyond the food security lens. So El Nino's reach is broader than food security is. That's the harvests, and we'll see the impacts on nutrition and food security later in the year or next year. But we also know the significant impacts of all these events on flooding, cyclones, and drought on cholera and vector-borne disease outbreaks, how heat stress increases mortality risk, and how health system readiness is really, really low in many of these countries. We also know the effects of these types of shocks on displacement and protection risks, how they drive displacement, erode livelihoods, forcing people to move, and how gender-based violence is spiking during and after these shocks. We also are very aware of the macroeconomic shocks that can result from these. I already mentioned GDP and public debt rising likely, and we're expecting these effects to compound over the coming year, really constraining government's own response capacity. So that's the end of my points, and I'll hand it back to you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. I think it's great that you mentioned it. John this morning also mentioned this point that yes, we talk a lot about drought, we talk a lot about the impact on food security, but also we are expecting extreme heat. We have currently a very dynamic international situation. There is a discussion going on in the chat, that there might be food crisis happening, not directly linked to El Nino, but linked to prices increasing because of El Nino, but also other things. In the frameworks you showed, it was mainly extreme weather, but the more classical drought, flood, and storms. Among the 29, is there also plans for heat, for maybe non-weather impacts linked to El Nino, and for not heat as, but yeah.
So those were the frameworks that we have that we link, closely or somewhat to El Nino. Beyond those, we have frameworks for. We have 2 frameworks for cholera right now, in the DRC and in Mozambique. So we're ready for those to activate. We have a range of frameworks that can activate that we are not linking to El Nino, that are maybe linked to La Nina, or that have no direct linkages to either of these phenomena. Right now, for joint UN frameworks, we don't have one for heat waves yet.
But it's something that is increasingly on your radar. I heard this morning, at least. Yeah.
Yes, no, absolutely. Yeah. And as I said, the Central Emergency Response Fund, as well as the country funds and regional funds that OCHA manages, are ready to support based on projections and high vulnerability for other shocks as well.
Thank you so much, Julia. There will probably be questions in the chat for you. And we come back at the end. I'm now moving to Josue, who's the Director of Programs and Community Resilience at El Salvador Red Cross. Hi, Josue. And you are actually already in the midst of it. Julia mentioned that 5 frameworks of OCHA are already activated. El Salvador Red Cross has also just activated their EAP, and we heard this morning that in the Red Cross globally, of course, the early action protocols that are in place, everybody works together to be ready, but that also, of course, there are other instruments that the Red Cross is using. But yeah, to hear a bit from you how it works in practice, Josue, welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Now we're going to explain a little bit of El Niño in El Salvador. We have experienced a few El Niño events throughout history here, but we will focus on recent history starting in the 90s. We had a prolonged dry spell that had recorded once again devastating corn and rice production in the eastern part of the country. Then we had that we consider an event of extraordinary intensity. It caused an extreme water shortage that drastically reduced river flows and affected both the agricultural sector and hydroelectric plants. The crisis of consecutive droughts in 2014 and 2015, El Niño triggers one of the worst food security crises in recent history in eastern El Salvador, principally San Miguel, La Unión, and Usulután. And in 2015, the absence of rain persisted for consecutive weeks, starting in June, leading to near total loss of the crops in the dry corridor, forcing the government to issue an emergency alert and consider large-scale food imports. We had also El Niño in 2018. This event broke local records by generating a period up to 40 consecutive days without rain, accompanied by sweltering temperatures. The prolonged heat wave caused millions of dollars in losses in the agricultural sector. We also had in 2023 El Niño that caused an extremely erratic winter, where farmers report estimated losses between 6 and 8 million of quintals of staple grains. The sectors here that are most vulnerable to El Niño are the subsistence agriculture, the hydroelectric sector, and public health, increasing the diseases linked to drinking water shortage, gastrointestinal and hygiene issues, and malnutrition in communities in the dry corridor. In accordance with our mandate, as the Red Cross, we provide humanitarian assistance aimed at protecting livelihoods and meeting basic needs, including healthcare, water, and sanitation. As we are, how are we right now as Salvadoran Red Cross? Institutionally, we have full coverage of the country across its 14 departments with 57 active branches. We have a national response plan that designates the regional offices in affected areas as first responders. The Salvadoran Red Cross is part of the National Civil Protection System, So it's one principal achievement that we have here. And the focus on anticipatory action has been institutionalized throughout El Salvador's General Directorate of Civil Protection, which principally has allowed for the streamlined implementation of early actions. So it's more faster to implement this way. We currently have 2 early action protocols. We have already activated, as Stephanie mentioned, one in response to drought, and the other is in preparation phase and may be activated this year. The main actions being considered here are water, sanitation, and hygiene promotion, WASH, protection of livelihoods, and emergency relief to meet basic needs through cash and voucher assistance. As an institutional coordination, we obviously coordinate with government agencies, with NGOs and civil society organizations. The implementation of all the humanitarian actions aims to avoid duplication of efforts, to expand the scope of the assistance provided, and we are auxiliary to the public authorities in the humanitarian field. So we try to do all these things together and not to duplicate any effort. Some of the challenges and difficulties that we have already as an implementer here is for us is our first activation of an early protocol, of an early action protocol. So it will be a lot of lessons learned. So it will be really good for us to activate this early action protocol. The second challenge is to implement some of many lessons learned from the activation of other plans in other national societies that we have heard of. We have heard a lot of lessons learned, so we have to really put a plan to implement them. And as I mentioned before, we have the possibility of have simultaneous activation of 2 early action plans for drought that we have already activated, and extreme rainfall that is most probably to activate this year. So this is for us mainly all of the financiation are for international cooperation. So we are looking for have a lot of cooperation for doing this. So it's pretty short. I think I'm cover a few things, so I'm open to hear some question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josue. I mean, first question would be like if you talk to the stakeholders in the country, you talked about the 2 EAPs that you might be ready to act. One you have just activated, and the other you are anticipating you might have to activate soon. Like, what are authorities most worried about? What are the other stakeholders most worried about at this moment? Is everybody so busy with the first activation that it's mainly that focus, or also already thinking of the next one?
Yeah, it's because I mean, for us culturally is more it's easier to do actions in response, but in anticipatory actions we are in a kind of like we are in an emergency, but we're not still there. So that's something that institutionally we have to. I think after this first activation, we will have this kind of conscience and culture inside the institution. You know that we have to do all all these activities really fast, because the window in where we have to do these activities are pretty short. I mean, in drought we have a few months, but in rainfall and other early action protocols we have just days. So that's a mindset that we have to implement here.
Thank you so much, Josue. There is more information on what the Red Cross is doing in the Americas currently in the chat. We also had a presentation this morning on the plans in Africa, and I think we will share both resources on the Anticipation Hub website. If you also want to list what your organization is planning to do and is doing already on the Anticipation Hub website, please indicate so in our survey. Tim already shared the link in the survey. We also ask you if you would like to have more region-specific in-depth webinars in the future as these El Niño events are coming up. Thank you so much, Josue. Please put your questions to Josue also in the chat. I'm moving over now and welcome Edwin. Hi, Edwin Magati, who's with ADRA Somalia. We are very happy to have you. Moving now back to East Africa, where I think, what Josue just talked about, to have potentially 2 activations in quite in a sequence is also something that you are looking at. Edwin, hello. What can you tell us about, what ADRA is currently working on?
Hi, Stephanie. I don't know if it's morning, evening.
Yes, for us, afternoon in Berlin, but I think for some people here it's still morning for our friends from the Americas. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, on behalf of my name is Edwin Magati, working for ADRA in Somalia. Trying to share my screen. Is it clear?
Yes, it's all fine.
Oh, all right. Yes, yeah, it was quite clear when Chris Chris did confirm the severity of El Niño, and as part of the team working in Somalia, it brings to point it brings to fore what we have been working on and what is ahead of us. But a small background, we have been working in partnership with Wahava, that's where Danga Life. We have been having a cross-border project between Ethiopia and Somalia, and we are doing basically that project because of the correlation between on what happens in Ethiopia when there's high rainfall and the impact of that rainfall downstream in Somalia. So we basically developed the EAPs or the protocols, and they are just due for activation. We are expecting the validation to be done probably later this month. In addition to the validation, we just confirmed from the CFO that the fuel funding is available for us. In the last year we were working on the documents, the EAP, but now the good news for us is now the fuel funding is available for us to be able to go to the next level once this the first level is the El Niño, and even beyond El Niño, whenever we'll be having the critical conditions are met, then we'll be able also to activate. So we have been working with SODMA. SODMA is the emergency arm of government that deals with emergencies. And we also get those are the ones who provide for us resources in terms of the meteorological information, although we go beyond SODMA because of the regional nature of our response to move to ICPAC, which handles the regional data for basically for rainfall and I think other adverse weather conditions. So we basically base our activation on the data on the forecast from ICPAC, the monthly forecast. And in addition to that, of course, we are able to look at additional information in terms of the water levels along the river channels. We basically have two main rivers in Somalia, and those two main rivers, they get the waters from, the bulk of the water comes from Ethiopia, although we are expecting now that there will be El Nino case. So we are going to have high rainfall, then it's going to be much more, because now the flooding is going to go beyond the river region where we have been trying to focus on. But if there will be local rains a lot, and then in addition to that, if we have heavy rains also from the Ethiopian highlands that feed the rivers, then we expect the conditions to be much more than what the El Nino events, which were experienced basically in the 1997-98 event, which had massive flooding, and of course we had about 2,000 people killed during that particular time, a number of animals, and of course disease outbreaks and crop destruction. So, and the 2023 event, there was also a reported displacement of over 700,000 people, and the confirmed deaths of about 118 people. And of course, with massive infrastructure destruction, including also now the farmland. All those, when those events have happened, basically it's largely during the October, November, December. So the anticipated El Nino, if it's going to be the same period, but I think from the projection of Greece, that's the expected period. So we basically now it's almost, we are heading to confirm that the scenario is going to be destructive and quite very destructive to the livelihoods of the common people within Somalia. Here, Somalia alternates between floods at times and droughts. That's a common phenomenon in the country. And I think, as mentioned earlier on by Stephen, there is the aspect of beyond these common challenges, there's also the other occasional insecurities which hamper smooth access or smooth implementation or smooth support for the people who are at risk. So with this expected change of situation, what we are planning as ADRA is we developed the two-phased approach. One is based on the seasonal forecasts, and then if the seasonal forecast, of course, which is almost now unlikely that there will be more rainfall, of course, we can trigger at phase one with readiness activities. And basically, I need to confirm here that we are not looking at the whole country. We are looking at one of the communities along the river channel. But we want to believe that if there are actors along the river channel, probably they will be able to probably address the same. I do know that the PFP, they have been working along with some of the villages. I know some other partners like CARE and SAVE also, they have some anticipatory actions along the river channel. So if once this has been confirmed, it's expected that we'll be able to trigger in phase one. Then the second phase will be if the Shabelle River increases to alert levels. So of course, we have different levels. The alert levels, it gets to around 7.3 meters. And in addition to that, if there's a 50 millimeter forecast of rainfall within 7 days. So the 50 millimeter was reached on because on the past events, they were able to correlate the flooding when the 50 millimeter of rainfall was reached in the highlands of Ethiopia. So when these two are met, then we expect to have a full activation of our AAP, and that way now we'll be able to support the communities, probably relocate to higher air levels, and support and provide them some cash for them to be able to keep safe, at least for a period of time, away from their normal place of residence. That's where they do the farming along the river channel. If it could be a same event, because as indicated by the team earlier, it's going to be stronger than that, then we are possibly going to look at the condition that will last beyond the 3 months. That's beyond the October, November, December, and it might now spill over to January. It will have the bulk of the land still underwater. That will cause massive damage to the product and to the farmland and animals, of course, animal disease because of the wetlands. So that then it means people will be isolated, or they would have been pushed out of their residences for a longer period, meaning that they might require longer humanitarian support. The basic lessons we have learned from the previous El Nino and the circumstances we have been working with is the need for early warning information by relevant government structures is very important. So now with these confirmations which are coming on, I think when the teams together, especially now the UN OCHA, whoever, I may call it, they have systems, bigger systems in place to engage the governments. So this, together with all the actors, they need to now start messaging through the government structures. And that now, that way we make everybody aware and people prepare accordingly to respond. Or if possible, for some people, for those who have been trained adequately, like the communities that we have been working with, I can give a recent example when the river levels got a little bit high, even just before alert, because they had been trained that when they see that they can move out. They moved out even before it was triggered. So if the governments push the messages earlier, quite early, and they get trained, they get to inform the communities, probably will be able to move to a situation where lives will be preserved. That's also one thing we have also noted is that there is an improvement in monitoring the water levels along the river channel. That would be a plus, especially if we have to depend on that for triggering. And it's critical now that SODMA, that is for Somali, is coordinating that, the emergencies, and they are the ones who will be giving the water levels, that would be helpful to at least to engage all the stakeholders involved to support them to act, trigger, or also inform the communities they are working with to take steps. And then in the previous El Nino events, which led to forced relocations and the occasions where people resisted moving. So it will be important that the development of AAPs include extensive engagement of government agencies and the communities to agree on relocation. You see, I think this is a common thing with human beings. People are comfortable with their lives, so they don't want really to move. So if they could have an aspect of engaging when you are developing the AAPs, include that within the AAPs, that would be good, and it will help people to at least move or take precautionary measures a little bit earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edwin. That was really insightful. Can you tell us, like, besides evacuation, what other actions are you planning?
Oh, we are planning to provide cash. Cash basically is the main thing, but also planning to apart from in the early stages, we can help clear the footpaths or the pathways where the people will be able to use to evacuate. And also, in addition to that, also we will also provide some cash for work activities, money for those who are able to support them, to support those who are not able, for them to be able to evacuate. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Edwin. It was lovely hearing directly from the community-based actors on how you will proceed. We are almost a few seconds from being out of time. If there are questions to the presenters, please put them in the chat. I think the chat will remain open a little while more so we can get answers to you. I also wanted to ask in the audience, I see Start Network, for example, if you just want to say for 30 seconds or 1 minute what you are doing, and everybody else, please also, if there is something the others should be aware of, please put it in the chat, put it in the survey so we can share it. In the survey, you will also be asked if you are interested in further more region-specific webinars where we would then also look more into what governments and regional organizations are planning, how the coordination works in each region, which bodies to connect to, and more. So if you are interested in that, please let us know via the survey. Ella, I don't know if you want to speak 30 seconds about what START has in the pipeline. If you are still here. You can't come off mute. Tim, can you unmute Ella?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so quickly, for Start Network, yeah, we're having the conversations internally. We have a range of small grants that we're really targeting to our members and thinking about how analysis can be done around El Niño and what the specific impacts can be in different contexts. A few of our members are working with the national Met departments to have some conversations and briefings around what specific impacts could be. And we're also considering kind of our own processes, our activities, our decision-making support, and what adaptations that we can be making considering El Niño. So it'd be interesting to hear if other agencies as well are kind of doing this internal reflections and seeing if any of these kind of adaptations can be made or there is any flexibility there. So thank you.
Thank you. So further discussion needed. This morning, I'm just saying this also for all the other participants. There were questions from specific actors for specific country, from specific countries on how to connect. Please do feel free to reach out to the Anticipation Hub if you want to know who else in your country is having a framework in place. I mean, normally you know better than us, but we do also have a database and might be able to connect you. Thank you so much for everyone to join. If there are last questions, please put them in the chat. Thank you for the core crowd who stayed until the end. I know 90 minutes in the afternoon or in the morning in the Americas on long working days can be quite long, but it was fascinating to have all of you, hear all of you, and also to see the engagement from the participants. Thank you so much for joining. There is more to come on El Niño, both on the hub and via the other stakeholders that you heard presenting and that you saw present in the chat. I do want to flag the the global climate outlook briefings that Tim had mentioned at the beginning of the chat, and Ella now also put the registration link. This is a really good way to also keep abreast of the forecasts evolving. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely either rest of the afternoon or rest of the day, and hope to see you again soon in another webinar. Bye-bye. Oh, and do the survey.